The Bobby O Show.
Welcome to the Bobby O Show. My name is Bob O. Potzner. I'm an attorney at the law firm of Collins, Hannafin, Danbury, Connecticut, where I served for many, many years as head of the litigation department. You know, I'm a big advocate of protecting the rule of law, as you can see in the graphic on this show. And I'm a graduate of Yale College and Duke Law School, which is pertinent to today's show and the guests that we have today. I've got in front of me my Constitution of the United States that carry with me at all times. So there's a hint as to what our show will be about today primarily. To me, the rule of law is critical to our society. And as a lawyer who practiced for 45 years, more or less, about 45 years, I have great faith in our legal system. But I'm also very concerned as I sit here today with where our country is headed. Although we don't have a perfect system of judiciary, we have the best in the world. And I want to make it very clear that I'm upset about it and concerned. That's why I've been involved in protest rallies and other things. And in connection with my concerns, I have had a couple of different shows focused on protecting the rule of law. Several weeks ago, I had a show with retired federal magistrate judge Jan Adler, who was a law school friend of mine and also of my guest Rod Smolla today. And Judge Adler talked about the concerns that he has with the safety of the judiciary. The judges are getting many, many threats. And he's concerned about how that may negatively impact our rule of law and our democracy. But today's show is my friend, my law school roommate, second year, and a graduate also of Yale College and Duke Law School, Rod Smolla, who is one of the preeminent scholars on the First Amendment and defamation of law, defamation individual law in our society. Rod, welcome to the show. I'm so pleased to have you on the show with us today.
It's great to be with you, Bob.
Last time I saw Rod, we did a alumni show for WYBC-FM 94.3 on your dial. We both broadcast Yale football together. And it's a pleasure, Rod. I haven't seen you in a while, and it's nice to see you here. Rod has an outstanding CV, but he also sent me a very limited biography, and I want to read it to you for today, just so you get a sense of the expertise and knowledge of this expert. And I'll read it to you right now. Rod Smolla is a professor of law at Vermont Law and Graduate School and senior counsel at Meyer, Watkins, Phillips, Push in Washington, D.C. He was previously president of Vermont Law School, graduate school that is, and has taught at 12 law schools, served as dean at 3 law schools, and been a university president. He is an active scholar, author, or editor of over 17 books and 100 articles. One of his books, Deliberate Intent, described his advocacy in a First Amendment case he led against a book publisher who published a murder-for-hire instruction manual. It was made into a movie by FX in which Timothy Hutton played the role of Rod Smolla. I don't know why Robert Redford didn't, but it was Timothy Hutton. Rod is also an active litigator, having been involved in presenting arguments in state and federal courts across the nation, including the United States Supreme Court. Among his most recent cases, he served as the principal First Amendment defamation law advocate who presented an argument representing Dominion voting in the celebrated case against Fox News, arising from false claims that the voting company was complicit in stealing the 2020 election from Donald Trump, resulting in a $787.5 million settlement in favor of Dominion. Rod, I just want to know, when do you sleep?
Well, not during your show, that's for sure.
Okay, that's for darn sure. Rod, just tell me a little bit how it was that you got involved in the movie related to the book that you wrote. I've got to ask that question first. Tell me about that.
Sure. So I was a litigator in this case. This was an unusual case in which a thug used a book that was designed to teach you to go into business as a professional assassin to commit 3 murders in the suburbs of DC. And the person who hired the murderer was convicted of murder. The actual hitman was convicted of murder. But the families of the victims thought that the book publisher that published this how-to manual should also be punished. And they asked me to represent them against the book publisher, which was essentially switching sides, because up to then I had always represented the speakers, not the people that were seeking to sue the speakers. So I was persuaded to take the case, and I took the case, and it was very dramatic. And when it was all over, after we prevailed, I wrote a book about it. And the book is kind of a murder thriller alongside the case that we did. That's not the book. The book I wrote was called Deliberate Intent, and FX bought the rights to the book and made it into a made-for-TV, legal drama. And Timothy Hutton played me. I thought I had better hair than him, but he played me.
Were you involved at all in writing the script to the movie?
I was involved behind the scenes. So the way this works is they buy the book rights from the author, and you agree to cooperate. And I was involved a lot as they wrote the screenplay, which took a surprisingly long period of time. It took almost a year for them to do it. It was actually the first movie ever done by FX, and it's okay. I mean, Timothy Hutton's performance was great. I think the writing in streaming services today, the writing on HBO and Netflix and FX has really progressed. If we did it over, I'd want the writing to be a little deeper. But yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was a real adventure.
I remember Rod was always a fantastic writer. That was one of his great skills, and he was number one of our class in Duke. And he wasn't even Cooper Flag, but he was number one in the law school.
Cooper got paid a lot more, for 1 minute of time at Duke than I ever got. That's for sure.
Rod, behind me these are hardcover books, and I've read about 85% of the books. But one of my most valued books I have on my shelf was a book you wrote about Larry Flint. I was reading a case in Connecticut probably 20 plus years ago. I can't remember when it was. And I'm reading the Supreme Court decision in Connecticut, and they quoted Rod Smolla. And I said, wait a minute. So I wrote Rod a little note, and Rod sent me back an autographed copy, which I cherish very much, of his Larry Flint book. You want to just mention that for a moment or two, Rod?
Yeah, so that was another colorful case that I was actually involved in. Larry Flint, the publisher of Hustler magazine, did a parody of Jerry Falwell, who in the day was one of the most powerful conservative televangelists in the United States. It was a very crude parody that depicted Falwell as having sex with his mother in an outhouse. So it was not speech you would particularly admire. And I convinced a number of major news organizations that they should back Larry Flint in the case, even though they didn't want to have anything to do with Hustler magazine, because the principle, which was very similar to what just surfaced with the big brouhaha over Jimmy Kimmel, the principle was that you should be able to use humor to poke fun at powerful people, including, in that case, very powerful religious figure, but of course, in the Jimmy Kimmel matter, the president of the United States, and that if the offended public person could sue for the emotional distress that they suffered, which was the theory that Falwell used, a lot of comedy as we know it, a lot of critique as we know it, would be subject to liability. So I was involved in the case and enjoyed it and thought the characters were colorful. And I later wrote a book about it. I also later went on tour with Larry Flint and Jerry Falwell. They became friends after the fact and went on a college tour, and I was sometimes the moderator between them. They were both actually very personable, friendly people, and I enjoyed their company. And I'll tell you one other quick story. A famous Broadway producer named Lewis Allen, who had produced some of the big Broadway shows like Annie and A Few Good Men, approached me to see if he could turn my book into a Broadway show. And of course I said, yeah, that'd be great. So after we fiddled around negotiating for a while, he said, you're a creative guy. Why don't you write the Broadway show? And I said, sure. I've never done anything like that before, but I'll try it. So I did 2 or 3 tries. He actually put me in touch with a very famous screenwriter named Calder Willingham, who wrote the famous movie The Graduate. And Calder told me what was wrong with my script. What was wrong is I made Larry Flint to be out funny and gregarious and a rounded character. And I made Jerry Falwell too much of a stiff. So I fixed it. And we got some very good actors to play the roles. William Macy, famous actor, played the role of Jerry Falwell. Peter Boyle, another famous actor, played the role of Larry Flint. And we did the show in Broadway when the theater was empty to try to get investors. And we got investors. HBO was willing to invest. A lot of private investors were willing to invest. So I was taken around New York to the Russian Tea Room to meet, Mike Nichols and all these famous folks. So I was convinced I was done with being a lawyer. I was going to live in Greenwich Village, wear a black turtleneck, and write shows. That's what I was doing. So we were gunning and ready, and it was exciting. And then Oliver Stone, famous movie director and producer, and Milos Forman announced, we're going to do a movie called People versus Larry Flint. And Woody Harrelson is going to play Larry Flint, and Ed Norton's going to play his lawyer. And, oh my God, all of a sudden took all the oxygen out of our project. So here I'll end with this by telling you this, Bob. In the movie, which is a great movie, there's this wonderful scene where Woody Harrelson, who's playing Larry Flint, snarls at his lawyer, Ed Norton, and says, Alan, I'm your dream client. I'm rich, I'm funny, and I'm always in trouble. Well, in real life, Larry Flint never said that. That's a line from my book. And so my dad, who since passed away, said, well, Rod, at least you're getting ripped off by a higher class of people.
When you said Peter Boyle, by the way, is that the gentleman who played the father in Everyone Loves Raymond? Is that Peter Boyle?
Yeah, and he was in Frankenstein and Young Frankenstein, and he played the lead role in a movie called Joe. He's passed away since, but he was a very colorful actor and perfect for Larry Flint.
Rod, when you were mentioning, and like I said in my trial notebooks, we jump around. I never get to my outline, but that's fine. These are great stories. I have had on my show a few times a very young, great, I think, singer-songwriter who's now in Nashville doing very, very well. And when 400 approximately artists signed a letter supporting Jimmy Kimmel, I sent this person a note saying that, what do you think about signing the note to support Jimmy Kimmel? And the singer-songwriter said to me, well, I'm really not political. And I wrote back to her saying, well, First Amendment rights are in the Constitution. I think supporting the Constitution does not make you a political person or being political. Any thoughts about that?
Well, it doesn't. It doesn't. I mean, I certainly know that there's artists that just choose to write about other themes. I mean, thinking about late night television, for example, one of the early giants of late night television was Johnny Carson, who then retired, and we had people like Jay Leno and David Letterman and people like Jimmy Kimmel and the whole host of folks. But Johnny Carson was never political, and he basically said, half my audience believes one thing, half my audience believes another thing. It's not my job to enter that. That's changed a lot, and I'm glad it's changed a lot. Late night television and things like Saturday Night Live, are enormously important forms of critique. But I'm not gonna criticize your friend because it's a free country, and some folks choose to write and sing about other stuff.
My point was more that it's to me. It's
I
not,
get, I know your point was that, but anyway,
still my friend. She's still my friend.
Yeah, good.
You and I have had disagreements over the years, and we're still friends.
I don't remember that. I thought we always agreed on everything.
Yeah, we pretty much did actually.
Yeah. All right.
In any event, I want to do one more thing. I want to go into. Tell me first of all, why is it you got so involved in First Amendment and defamation? What led you to want to focus your career on those issues?
It was purely an accident, just like accidents happen in life. I mean, I enjoyed those courses in law school, but never dreamed I'd have a chance to practice in the area or be writing about it. So here's the quick story. I was a young corporate lawyer in Chicago, my hometown. And the big shot law firm that I worked for, Mayer Brown, mainly representing famous, corporate entities, also by happenstance happened to represent the Catholic Archdiocese of Chicago and the Cardinal of Chicago, who ran the diocese. And there was a very colorful renegade priest named Andrew Greeley who wrote salacious novels, including one about the Cardinal. It was fictionalized, but it was thinly fictionalized, called The Cardinal's Sins. And it depicted a corrupt, Catholic cardinal that had all sorts of sexual affairs. And so the cardinal wanted to sue the priest. All right. He did not go to the Pope or anything. He wanted to sue the priest. And nobody in this corporate law firm knew anything about defamation law. They really, it wasn't their area. So I got assigned as a young lawyer to research it all. And I found out it was fascinating. But I also found out that most of the scholars in the area were dead people. I mean, people died 20 years before. And although there were some prominent lawyers doing practice in the area, there really wasn't anybody making a living as a scholar in the area at this point. And it was a rapidly developing area of First Amendment law. And I thought, maybe I could make my mark in this. And so I ended up leaving the law firm, becoming an academic, writing about this stuff. And then I got recruited to be a litigator and turned out loved doing that. And I've sort of been in both those worlds ever since.
I think Hemingway once said, luck is a residue of design. Luck is a residue of design. You like that? It's for
I love it. It's great. I'll rip it off. I love that. Yeah. I'll cite him. Yeah.
I want to focus a little bit on the Supreme Court because, and a lot of the questions that I'm going to have for you today, as we had in our prep show, deal with the Supreme Court and my concerns and many people's concerns about what's going on with the Supreme Court. And one of the issues that I have is that, and I'd like to talk about this, is that the Supreme Court is barely mentioned in our Constitution. By that, I mean it is mentioned, but it says, for example, in Article 3, Section 1, the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. But it doesn't really say that much about the concept of judicial review. And I can remember in our class with constitutional law, brilliant professor Van Alstyne, as I said before we started, I believe that he was, on his motorcycle, in his leather pants, and he was the star as far as I was concerned with Professor Wiestart at Duke Law School. And we spent about a month on a case called Marbury versus Madison. I remember thinking way back then, that was a seminal case in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Why are we spending so much time in this case? Well, as I grew up and realized that the importance of that case, and even now, judicial review and the ability for the Supreme Court to make decisions that are enforced are very important in our country. You want to talk a little bit about judicial review and the powers of the Supreme Court, Rob?
So I now teach constitutional law. I've probably taught it 40 times. And as much as I loved our professor, I teach that class in a day, I teach that class in a day. There's just too much else, other stuff to do. So let me talk about it a little bit. You mentioned that the Supreme Court is described in the Constitution in what's known as Article 3, and it's very, very short. It's a page or so. I mean, depending on how big your copy of the Constitution is. And the Constitution has brilliant aspects, and it has oversights and blunders. and it has shameful aspects. I mean, the original Constitution ensconced slavery, so it's not a perfect document. But the framers, in terms of the Supreme Court and the lower federal courts, did not think things through. So one of the first bonehead moves, it was just a complete blunder. There's nothing in the Constitution that tells us how many justices should be in the court. That's ridiculous. They should have put a number down, and it should have been an odd number, because you always want to have your courts have odd numbers. So there's a tiebreaker. So they could have picked 3, they could have picked 5, they could have picked 7, they could have picked 9. They didn't put a number down. So that'd be like, we're going to create a new game called basketball, and you just put however many players you think is right out on the court, And so that left the number of justices in the control of Congress and the president, and it's changed over the years. It's been at 9 for quite some time, but there have been pressures recently during the Biden years to increase it, because liberals were unhappy with the conservative rulings of the court. Well, you could see pressures in the other direction if the Supreme Court ends up blocking many of the executive orders of President Trump. But to answer your question directly, as our Chief Justice, John Roberts, is fond of saying, democracy was not the innovation of the United States Constitution. Democracies had existed for thousands of years. They'd existed in ancient Rome and existed in Greece. They were imperfect, but they existed. The idea of democracy was well established long before our Constitution. But what our unique contribution to governance and to the progress of the human race was the idea of judicial review, the idea that began with Marbury versus Madison, which is this amazing notion that we live in a country where judges and justices who have lifetime tenure during good behavior and in theory are independent of politics can strike down the laws passed by the political branches, strike down a law passed by Congress and signed by the president, or strike down the actions of a president through something like an executive order. That was extraordinary. That was a uniquely American notion. And it has been one of the most powerful ideas that has influenced the shape of our country. So much of what we are as a country has come not through political action, but through the actions of the Supreme Court, sometimes for evil, like the Dred Scott decision that ensconced slavery and essentially led to the Civil War. Other decisions after the Civil War that gutted the Civil War amendments, most notoriously Plessy versus Ferguson from the 19th century, that created the doctrine of separate but equal. So there have been shameful things in the Supreme Court's history, but there have also been extraordinary things, like Brown versus the Board of Education that overruled, separate but equal. A whole slew of modern cases that gave this country robust protection for free speech. A whole slew of cases that protect criminal defendants in the criminal justice process. Cases that protect religious freedom. Cases that protect individual privacy. And those have gone up and down, but they've been powerful, including, the same-sex marriage decision, Obergefell versus Hodges. So much of our national identity, so much of what we are as a country has been the offspring of Marbury versus Madison.
When can I sign up for your course? Do you take old guys in your course to take your concepts?
You do, but you'd be still considered young at heart, I think. but I don't count on us for a scholarship.
How about a basketball scholarship? Now you've seen me play basketball. Yeah. A couple of things that you mentioned, though, as a political science major at Yale that I was, I've read the Federalist Papers a couple of times, and I think we often forget, I'm sure you don't, that part of the content of the Constitution was political in part. For example, the way slavery was dealt with was sort of a compromise in some respects. And so I agree with you that the document is not perfect, but it's our perfect. It's our document we have to deal with. And your reference to the word good behavior, that is actually a topic that I want to get into, which is you and I as attorneys licensed to practice law and judges, as judges who are part of the judiciary, have an obligation under the canons of ethics. The Supreme Court does not truly, in my opinion, have a real canon of ethics. I think Roberts tried to do something. I'm not sure what he did exactly. But my question to you is, how much power does the Congress have, the legislative body, assuming they ever got back into session, ever want to do their jobs? How much power do they have to require certain ethical requirements upon the Supreme Court so that people like Justice Thomas and Alito, if they had conflicts, really would have to recuse themselves? Thoughts about that, Ron?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably substantial power. First, the Constitution itself has a clause that has the nickname the Necessary and Proper Clause, and it gives to Congress the powers to enact laws necessary and proper, not only to carry out Congress's responsibilities, but also the responsibilities of any other branch of government, which includes the executive branch and the judiciary. So Congress does have significant authority, if it wants, to legislate in matters that impact the operation of the judiciary, and that could clearly include ethics restrictions and a code of ethics, in my view. Now, what Congress can't do is interfere with the core function of the judiciary. Congress can't overrule a judicial decision on the meaning of the Constitution. It can overrule a judicial decision on the meaning of a federal statute because Congress wrote the statute, and it can decide that it thinks the court has interpreted it wrongly and change it. And that happens, from time to time. But Congress can't do that. And there's a limit to the extent that Congress could interfere with other core judicial functions. But if you'll let me go back to the lifetime tenure during good behavior, we know that one of the reflexes of President Donald Trump is to rail against people that he doesn't like, and that includes railing against judges that rule in ways that he's not pleased with. And he will scream at them for being corrupt and claim that they're partisan, and sometimes call for their impeachment if they dare rule against what he thinks is the right ruling. And to his credit, Chief Justice Roberts has said that's contrary to our American traditions. It's not appropriate grounds for impeachment that you disagree with the ruling of a judge. What you do if you disagree with the ruling of a judge is appeal. But disobeying the order, which you may want to get into, Bob, is not allowed. And simply saying the judge should be removed because we don't like the way the judge called it on the merits is completely contrary to our traditions. And let's hope it doesn't happen.
Well, that ties into shadow dockets. And I'm not sure where shadow dockets really came from. I'm sure there are some instances where immediate decisions are necessary, but I can't tell you the numbers. You probably know better than I do, the number of decisions by shadow dockets in the last 9 months under the Trump administration versus what happened perhaps in the prior 90 years. And the major concern I have about the shadow dockets is a couple of things, and you can comment upon these. Number one is they're typically, unless there's a dissent of some type, there's no real ability to understand the thinking and the logic of the Supreme Court. And there's a phrase we call stare decisis, which essentially means prior precedent being dealt with. So we don't really have that to consider. And the other a factor that bothers me is that there have been a lot of injunctions issued by the Supreme, or overruling of injunctions, shall I say, by the Supreme Court on decisions by lower federal courts, which essentially in many cases, in my opinion, could override the case itself by the time the case gets decided by the Supreme Court. So any comment on all those two comments
Sure.
I made?
So let me first for your viewers just talk a little bit about what lawyers mean when they talk about the shadow docket. So I've argued a case in the U.S. Supreme Court. I've briefed lots of cases in the U.S. Supreme Court. And the typical way the Supreme Court operates is a lower court will render a decision, and it usually will be a decision that has already been appealed, let's say to a state Supreme Court or to a federal appellate court, and the losing party attempts to get the U.S. Supreme Court to hear the case. And the odds that the Supreme Court will hear the case are low. The court hears very few cases. Less than 5% of the petitions that it is presented with doesn't grant review in. And then it usually takes typically about a year, sometimes 2 years, for it to wind its way through the Supreme Court. So the court will say, yeah, we take the case, and then there'll be a schedule to brief the case, and that may take months, might take 6, 7, 8 months. Both sides write their briefs. If it's a big deal, if it's on important issues, other parties can enter the case, and they're called friends of the court. The fancy Latin term is amicus curiae, and they can write briefs giving their views as to how the court should hear it, decide it. Then there'll be a day when the argument is scheduled, and the argument's surprisingly short, typically 30 minutes aside. It's very dramatic, very interesting exercise in our government. And then it can take months before the court renders a decision. Sometimes it takes a year because of the timing and when the argument takes place. The Supreme Court just heard a giant Voting Rights Act case that it heard last year and couldn't make a decision, and heard it for re-argument just this week. So typically it's a long, thoughtful process, and a year's worth of deliberation, lots of briefing, and then when a decision is issued, it's usually a very thorough explanation of why the court ruled as it did. These days, often pretty darn long, 20, 30, 40, 50 pages, sometimes 100 pages, sometimes 200 pages. I mean, it can be a long opinion with a lot of detail, maybe too long. I mean, the Supreme Court has decided a lot of famous cases in earlier times that were a lot shorter, but they still got the job done. But in any event, that's the normal process. So the court has always had an emergency docket, and that's the more official name for it. And this is when events are happening so quickly that the Supreme Court has to intervene, maybe not on the actual merits, but has to slow things down. And it's either being invited to prevent something from happening until it has a chance to rule on the case, or sometimes allow something to happen even while the litigation is going. It can go either way. So the classic use of this was in death penalty cases, where an execution would be scheduled and there were arguably grounds for the Supreme Court intervening. Obviously, if the prisoner is executed, there's no point. And so the emergency docket might be used to try to get the court to prevent the execution pending some longer adjudication of it. There can also be dramatic events in which just the press of events requires the court to move with extraordinary speed. So in Bush v. Gore, when nobody knew who won the 2000 election, nobody knew who Florida had gone for, the Supreme Court had to act with emergency speed to decide the rules of the game involving that election. When Harry Truman seized steel mills during the Korean War, the Supreme Court heard argument in the case and made a decision within a couple of weeks. In the very famous Pentagon Papers case involving leaks from Daniel Ellsberg about the Vietnam War, a case that is chronicled in the great movie by the late Robert Redford, All the King's Men, Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman. Also, more recent movie, The Post, with Meryl Streep and Tom Hanks. That dramatic event, the Supreme Court heard in a matter of days. So what's been happening lately? What's been going on lately? Well, there have been 380 or so lawsuits challenging the executive orders of the president, challenging them on grounds that he lacks the power to issue the order, challenging them on grounds that they violate some provision of the Constitution, like due process or freedom of speech. And the president has done very poorly in that litigation in lower federal courts. I don't know the current stats, but over the summer, I had to give a speech on this. And at the time, there had been 230 cases, and lower courts had ruled against the president and blocked what the president wanted to do in 190 of them. So that's a really poor batting average if you're the president of the United States. That reminds me of many of the lean years as a Chicago Cubs fan. So anyway, now there's been 380 cases, but I think the pattern's been more or less the same. Lower courts are ruling against the president over and over and over again. Well, what then happens is the government, the federal agency, the Department of Justice, the Office of the President, goes eventually to the U.S. Supreme Court and says, we're not looking to have you decide the case on the merits. We know we got to have briefs and hearings and evidence and witnesses and all that stuff. But what we want you to do is stay the lower court's decision. So not allow the lower court's injunction against what the president's trying to do to remain in force while we thrash it out in the litigation. So let the president keep doing what the president wants to do until ultimately we get a final decision on the merits. And the president's batting average in the U.S. Supreme Court on those applications for a stay has been the reverse. He's been batting about 800. He's gotten like 20 out of 24 decisions from the Supreme Court, typically following the court's ideological division. So typically with the three liberal justices, Justice Kagan, Justice Sotomayor, Justice Jackson, dissenting, sometimes writing a dissent that explains their beef with what the Supreme Court has done. And the practical impact of this is the president sort of wins without winning, because let's say the president wants to fire somebody. Well, if the person stays fired while the case is being litigated, as a practical matter, the president's gotten what he wants. In a lot of these cases, it involves funding, where the president is withholding funding that Congress has appropriated. And if the Supreme Court says you don't have to spend it while we're thrashing this out, then basically you run out the clock if you're President Trump. The funding expires on its own, or by the time the Supreme Court decides the case on the merits, a year from now, the programs are dead. People have been fired. So that's the pattern that you're talking about, and I agree with your critique of it. I think it's a shame in most of these cases, and it's giving the president wins in situations where ultimately there's a very good chance he's going to lose, even in front of this Supreme Court on the merits.
That's an excellent explanation. Just a couple of comments. My law practice has been as a trial lawyer, and the difference between a trial lawyer is that we have judges or juries that decide cases on the merits, and then there are certain rules as to what the appellate courts and Supreme Court can do with those decisions. But it's very critical to be successful in your case at the lowest level of court, the original jurisdiction level. And from my experience, getting injunctions ruled one way or the other is very difficult, because the standard is, in Connecticut, and every state has a little bit different, but in state court, it's got to be irreparable harm with no adequate remedy at law. And you have a really good chance of winning. I use the word really, that's my word, a really good chance of winning your position at the time of the ultimate trial. And the concern I have is, and I'm not a big believer in polls. As a poli-sci major, I've done a lot of reading about how polls are done and how the questions asked can impact. It's almost like a leading question in a trial case. So I'm not thrilled with watching polls, but I like to watch the way they go over time to see if they're up or down or whatever. And I think there is a major decrease in respect for the Supreme Court, I think in large part because of making these kinds of decisions, which they're 80% of the time, for example, giving President Trump a win that's not really a win in the long run. But Mr. Garcia, who had to go back and forth through foreign countries when I think his due process rights were clearly overruled, it gives the court political power, and I think the Supreme Court is doing no good service to our country, to them. And I often have wondered about what would happen if President Trump said, you know what, I don't like Justice Jackson, you're out. Will the Republican Party say, wait a minute, you got to impeach first? I don't know what would happen, but that's just a concern I have, and your explanation, Rod, was really helpful. And I'm going to move on unless you have a further comment on what I just said.
No, I'll let you have the last word. I agree with you, basically.
Oh, thank you very much. Since you have been a professor and a college president and dean, you obviously have been involved in not only the education of universities, but the political process and fundraising, et cetera, that exists in universities. I'm appalled at the universities in the United States of America that have capitulated to the edicts of President Trump. Harvard apparently now has not yet given in, and it's the first time I'd ever give money to Harvard in my whole life as a Yale grad, but Harvard's got to stand strong. But I'd like you to comment a little bit about what's going on with the pressures, executive orders, et cetera, and the powers that be putting on universities and schools like Columbia, which have settled the case, which ostensibly were for protecting against anti-Semitism, but I never saw where the money went to Jewish causes. Any comments about what the universities are doing from their perspective and what the government is doing to push universities?
So I just gave a talk at Vanderbilt on this, and I've been talking in a lot of different places about this. The way I would put it is that things like free speech and academic freedom are under siege. And I use the word siege as a kind of military term of art. Because in military terms, a siege is something you do in contrast to a direct assault or a direct attack. So it's an ancient military tactic. Let's say there's a fortified city or a fortress or a citadel, and you think you'd be doomed if you just frontally attacked the city. So instead you surround it, you starve it, maybe you lob, artillery into it. You try to starve it into submission. And that is effectively what is going on right now, because a frontal attack on the freedom of a university to teach what it thinks should be taught, to allow professors to take the positions they think professors should be free to take, would be certainly doomed under our First Amendment. There's just no doubt that it would be an open and shut violation of the First Amendment, for example, for the president to say no American university can teach the desirability of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or no university in the United States can teach the notion that there is climate change being caused by the way in which we produce energy in this world, and it needs to be mitigated for the good of the earth. If you teach those things, you go to jail. Well, of course, that would be struck down by courts. It would lose 9-0 in the Supreme Court of the United States. But here's the siege tactic. You don't do that. What you instead say is, we give out a lot of federal money to you universities, or it can be others. We give out a lot of federal money to law firms that engage in business with the federal government. Guess what? If you want to keep your money, you better toe the line and do what we tell you. And if you don't, you go ahead and say what you want to say, teach what you want to teach, but you're going to lose the money. And in a lot of instances, we're talking big dollars. They went after UCLA for $1 billion, Harvard for a couple billion. The big research universities get a lot of federal money, often for sciences and other kinds of very expensive research, healthcare, and so on. And that's the tactic being used. And So I'll tell you what I think is the right thing to do, but I also want to tell you why it ain't easy if you're a university president or a board of trustees, because I've been in this position. The right thing to do is to say no. The right thing to do is to say we have our academic freedom. We back the freedom of our students. We back the freedom of our faculty. We choose ourselves what positions we're going to take on these issues. We certainly let our students and faculty have the freedom to take their positions, and we're not going to be bullied. So that's the right thing to do. And there have been universities in the last couple of days that have refused to sign on to this new compact that the president has dangled in front of schools. And I admire their courage in saying no. I don't have the tally right in front of me, but I know that MIT has officially said no, and Brown has officially said no. So that takes a lot of guts. But here's the other side of the coin, and I'm not defending it. I'm just placing it in human terms. You know, you may think, oh, we'll give up the money because you guys are rich anyway, and why would you trade money for your principles? But the money supports human beings. The money supports programs. The money supports employees. If you're a university and somehow and all of a sudden, $20 million or $200 million has been taken out of your budget, and that's what you use to fund this cancer research center, or that, this center on poverty, or this center on space research, or this center on healthcare, and the money goes, you probably have to lay off those folks. You probably have to close the program, and that's excruciatingly painful. So it's hard. I don't want to sit on a high horse, because I know what it's like when you're facing federal grants being taken away, and I know the human toll it takes, and it's one of the shameful aspects of what's going on here. If you give me one more second, Bob, I want to make one more point.
Absolutely, go ahead.
People might wonder, well, what are the rules of the game? Are there any constitutional restrictions on this kind of use of money leverage to influence things like free expression? And it's a complicated area, First Amendment law. But here's the basic rule, which actually comes from a famous decision by John Roberts, who tried to bring order to this. The government does have the right to decide it's not going to fund certain stuff. The government can say, we don't want to be in the business anymore of funding foreign aid. We don't want to be in the business anymore of funding abortions. We don't want to be in the business anymore of funding studies of climate change. It can do that. And we may not like it, but that's a political decision, and it's not a violation of the First Amendment. But here's what you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to say, unless you toe the line on these issues, we're going to take funding away that has nothing to do with the particular program. So let me just give a simple example. Let's say you got a university and they're getting $200 million a year for cancer research. And the government says, guess what? You're going to lose that $200 million if your English department teaches books we don't like. You're going to lose that $200 million if your provost's office has a diversity department. You're going to use that $200 million if you got law professors that are teaching critical race theory. That you can't do. You can't use the money to try to skew free speech and academic freedom in matters unrelated to the direct subsidy. That, at least, is my view of where the law, properly understood, is right now. It's a soft spot in First Amendment law, and the administration is seeking to exploit it. And we'll just see how it turns out. It'll be really interesting to see how it turns out. I suspect we'll get some big decisions on this, maybe by the end of this Supreme Court term, maybe by early summer.
Ron, I spent 15 years on elected boards of education. I lived in Shelton when I was 24 years old, living at home for a year. And I got to the Board of Education, my hometown of Shelton, Connecticut. And I was there 9 years on the Board of Ed and 6 years on the Richfield Board of Education. And one of our functions, and I was chairman of curriculum committee in both boards of ed for certain periods of time, was to approve the books. And what we used to do in Ridgefield was the superintendent of schools or assistant superintendent of schools in charge of curriculum would put the books on a table and we'd skim through them for a little bit, for a few minutes. And when I was chairman, I said, you know what, whatever the administration says are the books to be read, fine with me. But we had one member who was very, very conservative, who would bring up, well, this book talks about this book talks about that. And my view was, we shut him down pretty much, and by votes of 8-1, we had 9 members on the board. And of course, that's why people have to not just look to our elected officials, our judiciary. We, the people, have to vote. And if the 7 or 8 million people who voted for Biden and did not vote in the election of Kamala Harris, who I supported, against Trump, we might have had a whole different situation. And that's where people have to take responsibility, not just to defer to others, but we have got to do it ourselves. That's what the Constitution talks about in voting rights. And that's why I'm really scared about whether A, we'll have elections in 2026, or B, if we have them, are we going to have fair and ethical elections where the votes are counted properly and people are not going to be thrown off the lines to vote or be afraid to vote because of the military. I'd like to talk a little bit about, Rod, if you wouldn't mind. We have about 6 or 7 minutes left in the show for today. I might persuade you to come back a second time if I'm lucky. But talk about the use of the military on our streets that's now being contested in the courts.
So there's a tradition against using military force to police civilian populations. There's also a law from the 19th century. It has a weird name, posse comitatus. You may see the old Westerns where the sheriff will say, let's pull out the posse. But that law on its own is a federal law that prohibits the use of federal military force to police civilian populations, except in cases of insurrection and rebellion. There have been some brave judges that have said the president lacks the power to deploy the National Guard or federal troops in cities like Los Angeles or Portland. There's litigation going on everywhere, Memphis, Chicago. And in my view, those judges are right. And I think it's a giant affront to our traditions of civil liberties. There's a reason we have historically not used our military to police civilian populations. And that's the idea that this is not a police state. This is not a dictatorship. This is a free and open society. Of course, we have crime. Of course, we have to deal with crime. There may be times when it's important to have federal resources deployed. There may occasionally be situations that are so wildly out of control that you need the National Guard. You may sometimes want to deploy the National Guard for good reasons. The National Guard was deployed to enforce desegregation in Little Rock, Arkansas, in the Little Rock Central High School crisis, to enforce the federal orders that ordered the school board to allow Black children to attend the school. So it's not that you would never do it, but you don't do it routinely. And not only is it an affront to our traditions and to the federal law, but it's such a blatant exercise in political discrimination. I mean, it's the president doesn't even hide the idea that he's, sending these troops to cities that have Democratic mayors. He's sending these troops into states that are predominantly Democratic politically. It's an extension, of his vindictive prosecutions against the likes of James Comey and others. Apparently, at any moment, John Bolton. And so that blatant use of the executive branch, including military power, in a politically partisan way, is totally contrary to our traditions. It erodes our sense of the rule of law. It polarizes and puts Americans against Americans, and it's shameful.
I mentioned at the start of the show that I've been head of my litigation department for many, many years. My mentor, Jack Garamella, who retired several years ago, when he was in his 20s, I guess it was, before you and I got to Yale, I think in the late 60s, early 70s, they had the Black Panther trials in New Haven, and there was a lot of activity. And the National Guard was called to the Yale Green. This is before we got there. And Jack had a gun, had a rifle, and people were putting flowers into the rifles. And he and his buddies in the military, and Jack, Dartmouth grad, went to Northwestern Law School, educated man, great person. They were a little afraid. They were afraid of what's going to happen if something goes off. And we have the Kent State, what happened in Kent State, and our law school buddy Rod Dillman wrote a book about. He went to Kent State. He was at Kent State the year after. You okay, Rod?
I'm good.
Rod Dillman, our law school buddy, was at Kent State the year after the shooting, and he wrote a book about. I think this title was called. I've read the book. It was called "Flowers Are Better Than Bullets." And things can happen. And what worries me is because of this pressure being put on these communities, that something may happen, even initiated by the National Guard, that's going to cause several problems. Rod, we only have 3 minutes left, and I want to give you a couple minutes to just summarize some different things. But I just also want to remind you, when we were at Yale, I'm sure you remember our senior year, the Shockley situation. Do you remember that, Rod? When William F. Shockley, who was a racist, his theory was that Black people were innately inferior intellectually. And our campus had two strong positions. One was free speech, let the guy speak. The other was civil rights. And it was controversial on campus. I don't remember anything getting physical, but it was to me, as a kid from Shelton, Connecticut, small middle class community, it brought attention to a lot of different issues. And luckily in those days, and by the way, we shot it down Shockley, he never spoke. But having said that, Rod, we got about 2 minutes left. I'm a little pessimistic. Here's some pictures of you, Rod. Tell us what these pictures are, please, and tell us, are you optimistic or pessimistic about our democracy in America? And you have 2 minutes for that.
Well, I'm guardedly optimistic. I mean, I have a lot of students that are dismayed, but this is not the first generation of people to face troubling times. And the country has endured over time. It endured the Civil War. It endured the Great Depression. It endured World War II, Vietnam, the Civil Rights Movement, although its promise is still not entirely fulfilled, was an enormously positive struggle against evil things. We managed to make it through 9/11. You know, this too shall pass. I believe, I'll give you an upset prediction. I believe that ultimately on the merits, people are going to be surprised by how often this Supreme Court, this conservative Supreme Court, will rule against the president. I'm sure the court will rule in favor of the president on his right to fire independent federal agency leaders. That's clearly going to happen. So he'll win that. But I think in some of these other challenges, like free speech, like his attempt to prevent the 14th Amendment declaration that if you're born in the United States, you're a citizen of the United States, from being completely fulfilled. I think on a lot of these issues, he's going to lose. I'm guardedly optimistic. But what are you going to do?
Rod, I want to thank you so very, very much. The hour passed so quickly, and we never discussed Yale or Duke basketball, which is unusual for us not to do that. Rod, I hope you'll come back sometime and be on the show because you've enlightened me, and I'm sure you've enlightened my audience. This has been Bobo Potsner with the wonderfully brilliant friend of mine, Rod Smolla, saying thank you very much. Welcome to the Bobby O Show.